going? I want to say good evening, everybody. And thank you all for coming. My name is Lorraine Carlson, and it's been my pleasure to have been both organized and facilitated this January 6th made easy presentation that you've all made time to come out to see. Our program is a special presentation of the Constitutional Democracy Committee, which is a subcommittee of Courageous Resistance Indivisible of the Desert, which is an all-volunteer action group started back in January of 2017, and Nicholas and I were there at that first meeting, and made up of ordinary citizens like you and me who are dedicated to achieving results through personal and group action driven by three core values: economic justice, human rights, and corporate and political leader accountability. I'd also like to thank and introduce each one of these democracy warriors seated on my left and right. Carol Doyle, Michael Johnson, Bob Mueller, Jamie Trachtenberg, and I also want to cite Kelly Watson, who worked on this with us over the last 3.5 months, and unfortunately couldn't be here tonight. These 6 people have, oh goodness, and may I ask you, well, before I continue, please silence your phones. That was a good one, actually. So Carol and Michael and Bob and Jamie and Kelly have been in the trenches with me over the last 3.5 months, reading and digesting this tome of a report, and I've been using it for weightlifting. It's about 5 pounds. And then we've been meeting every Saturday since February on Zoom to discuss each section and chapter and delve into the hundreds of footnotes referenced at the end of each chapter. Yes, it's been a lot to get through. And even though the report was released back in December, actually December 22nd to be exact, by the 9 members of the U.S. House Select Committee, or more commonly known as the January 6th Committee, we feel as though we've just begun to scratch the surface on all the critically important information contained within it. But here we are. And in putting this presentation together, we have 3 goals for tonight's presentation. We want to share the reports through, with key findings, as much as we can of the who, what, where, when, why, and how we can do within the next 2 hours. And since it took us well over 90 hours to read each part of the report, share the central themes, facts, insights, and conclusions we believe are critically important for everyone to know about, share some action steps that we hope you'll want to take during the coming days, weeks, months ahead, mostly to help ensure accountability so that the January 6th report's specific recommendations and action steps will be fully addressed and acted upon. So before we begin, and I seem to be having technical difficulties.
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Hold the cord, that part that's attached to the mic. Grip
Like
that. Yeah.
How's that? Oh, that's better. Okay. So we're going to kindly ask you, do you hold any questions and comments until the end of the presentation, mainly because we think most of it will have been covered, we hope, during the presentation. And if not, then rest assured, we built in Q&A at the end. And note, there'll be about a 10-minute intermission at midpoint for everyone to get up, stretch their legs, get a snack, use the restrooms, which, by the way, are just outside the doors here to the right and your immediate left, right before the doors leading into the library. But since we have a lot to share about what's in the report, let's get started.
So, considering the monumental scale that unfolded as the Congressional Committee, their investigation proceeded, it's something of a small miracle that this report was completed in such incredible detail. It's a fact-based report with corroborated testimonial, researching, verified, verifying quotes and sworn testimony. So more than 1,000 witnesses were interviewed. They conducted 10 live televised broadcasts, presenting testimony from more than 70 people, 42 of which were from Trump's inner circle, including Bill Barr, former White House counsel, numerous White House aides and staff members, Trump's former campaign manager, his former campaign general counsel, and his lovely adult children. They obtained critically important information from relevant litigation in federal district and appellate courts, as well as from the U.S. Supreme Court, and the report's 4 forewords by Ari Melber, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Chairman Benny Thompson, and Vice Chair Liz Cheney, and the following 8 chapters and 4 addenda describe the facts that fully illuminate Trump and his co-conspirators' 8-part plan and conspiracy to game the system and break the law, all to keep Trump in power by overturning and voiding President Biden's electoral victory and really challenging the very being of American democracy.
As a result, House Select Committee members voted unanimously to refer former President Donald J. Trump to the United States Department of Justice for criminal prosecution on 4 separate counts. The first time in American history, Congress recommended a criminal referral against a former U.S. president. These 4 counts include obstruction of an official proceeding, the proceeding being the January 6 joint session of Congress to certify the Electoral College votes from each state. The penalty for violating the statute is a fine and/or imprisonment of up to 20 years. Conspiracy either to commit any offense against the United States or to defraud the United States. The committee argues this happened in multiple ways, including Trump's lies about the 2020 election and Vice President Pence's role in Congress certification, among other issues. Conviction of this statute carries a penalty of a fine and/or no more than 5 years in prison. Conspiracy to knowingly make a false statement. The committee said Trump broke the statute by participating in a plot to submit fake states of electors. And finally, assisting, aiding, or comforting an insurrection. The committee strongly believes Trump incited the U.S. Capitol attack, but notes he was impeached on that charge already. The committee further concludes there is enough evidence to convict and therefore charge him with, quote, assisting, aiding, or comforting the insurrection. The report goes into great detail about Trump's actions before and after January 6th, his actions as the attack unfolded, and his inaction and disregard for not stopping it.
The report begins with an executive summary that lays out the panel's 17 findings, organized around 2 key areas of investigation: Trump's unlawful conduct and criminal negligence, and pre-attack intelligence and how law enforcement and various government agencies reacted. There were 12 findings laying out the case, proving Trump's central role in both orchestrating and actualizing a multi-part conspiracy and coup plot to overturn the 2020 presidential election and remain in power. Number 1, purposely using lies and provocation to overturn the election and raise money. Beginning election night 2020 and continuing through January 6th and until thereafter, Donald Trump purposely disseminated false allegations of fraud in order to aid his effort to overturn the election and to solicit contributions. These lies directly provoked his supporters to violence on January 6th. 2, not honoring the Constitution. Despite knowing otherwise, Trump refused to honor his constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, but instead plotted to overturn the election outcome. 3, corruptly pressuring Vice President Pence. Trump knew it was illegal, but he relentlessly and corruptly pressured Vice President Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th, and despite knowing that no state had or would submit an altered state of electors. 4, targeting the Department of Justice. Trump relentlessly tried to enlist top DOJ officials to lie to help overturn the election. When that failed, he offered the job of acting Attorney General to Jeffrey Clark, who, according to past witness testimonies, intended to disseminate false information aimed at overturning the election. Oh, still good. 5. Pressuring state officials. Without any evidence of fraud or election irregularities, Donald Trump unlawfully pressured state officials to change the election results in those states. 6. False electors. Trump oversaw an effort to create and submit false electoral certificates to Congress and the National Archives. 7. Pressuring members of Congress. Donald Trump pressured members of Congress to object to valid slates of electors from several states. 8. False information in court. Donald Trump purposely verified false information filed in federal court. 9. Summoning and provoking the crowd. Trump summoned tens of thousands of his supporters to Washington with baseless claims of election fraud. Although known to be angry and armed, Trump instructed them to march to the Capitol to take back their country. 10. Condemning Pence during the attack. Trump purposely went on social media to condemn Vice President Pence at 2:24 p.m. on January 6th, knowing that the violent attack was underway and his own words would incite more violence. 11. Failing to act. For 3 hours and 7 minutes, Trump watched the violence and mayhem unfold on television, but refused repeated requests to tell his violent supporters to disperse and leave the Capitol. And finally, 12. Conspiracy. Each of these actions by Donald Trump was taken in support of a multi-part conspiracy to overturn the lawful results of the 2020 election.
The 5 findings detail the failures by intelligence agencies and law enforcement to effectively anticipate and guard against the violence at the Capitol. 1. Prior warnings of violence. Intelligence agencies, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, Secret Service, National Security Council, and U.S. Capitol Police had all identified threats that were true or credible during the days and weeks before the right-wing extremist militia groups led by the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and 3%ers were planning violence on January 6th. But failures to fully process, share information, and connect the dots left those securing the Capitol unprepared for the onslaught. 2. Antifa and other left-wing groups were not involved to any material extent in any counter-demonstrations or counter-efforts against Trump supporters on January 6th. Indeed, intelligence on January 5th indicated that some left-wing groups were instructing their members to stay at home and not attend on January 6th. 3. Intelligence and law enforcement missed Trump's plans. Law enforcement and intelligence agencies did not understand the full extent of planning by Trump, John Eastman, Rudolph Giuliani, and others working to overturn the election results. The agencies did not, and potentially could not, anticipate Trump's provocations at the ellipse, nor the scale of violence and lawlessness that ensued at the Capitol complex afterwards. There also wasn't any advance assessment done to predict Trump's behavior, nor his refusal to direct his supporters to leave the Capitol once the deadly assault started. 4. U.S. Capitol Police were unprepared, but other forces were more proactive. Capitol Police leadership didn't have sufficient assets in place to address the scale of chaos that ensued after Trump instructed tens of thousands of his supporters during his ellipse speech to, quote, march to the Capitol and take back our country, and later sent out the tweet condemning Pence at 2:24. The Washington Metropolitan Police Department was more proactive and ultimately deployed about 800 officers, while the Department of Justice had a group of agents ready outside of Washington. 5. Miscommunication at the Pentagon. No assistance from Trump. There was likely miscommunication by civilian leaders at the Pentagon, which delayed sending help to the Capitol, while also stating that there's no evidence this was intentional. In addition, Trump never gave an order to send the National Guard or any other federal support to the Capitol. The decision to deploy the National Guard was delegated to the Pentagon.
Okay, are you depressed? It gets worse. So our next question is, who aligned themselves with Trump's corrupt efforts to stay in power? We now are showing you a top-down pyramid of the who's who at each level. And of course, the mastermind is you-know-who. But then we have the primary architects and allies. These are the attorneys who drank the Kool-Aid, such as Mark Meadows, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Kenneth Chesebro, Jeffrey Clark, Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, Boris Epstein, Jason Miller, Roger Stone, Michael Flynn, Kash Patel, Sidney Powell, Cleta Mitchell. I mean, the names go on and on. Jenna Ellis, John McEntee, and Vince Haley. And then not least, but Donald J. Trump Jr. and his girlfriend, Kimberly Guilfoyle. They're all part of the primary architects and allies. Then we have 147 Republican allies in Congress who actually voted to overturn the election on January 6th when the joint session of Congress met. Interestingly, of that number, 8 were from the Senate. Many names are household names: Ted Cruz, Ron Johnson, Tommy Tuberville, Rick Scott, Roger Marshall, Cindy Hyde-Smith, John Kennedy, and Josh Hawley. And then there's 139 others in the House, including, you'll love this one, the state delegation from California, Ken Calvert, Darrell Issa, Kevin McCarthy, Devin Nunes, and Mike Garcia. There's 2 more, but I don't know who they are, so I'm not going to mention them. And then there's a few more: Jim Jordan, Lauren Boebert, Paul Gosar, Louis Gohmert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mo Brooks, Matt Gaetz, Andy Biggs, Scott Perry, and 121 other Republican representatives. But an interesting person that we've added into this group, which I guess would be former members of Congress, is Newt Gingrich. So many of us remember Newt from the 90s. So he aligned himself with Trump. So he may be up there in the primary. I don't think he's a primary architect, but he's definitely an ally. Then we have the legislators in battleground states. There's 300 of them, so rest assured I'm not going to read any of them. But these are the 300, believe it or not, who participated in private briefings and phone calls with Trump and others between November 10th, 2020 and January 3rd, 2021. Money financiers and friends of Donald's. Really kind of interesting in reading this report was finding out that $3 million was donated by Publix billionaires Julie Fancelli to pay for the transportation costs of militia members and groups to amass in D.C. $3 million.
Spectacular.
Right? And then there's former Overstock CEO Patrick Byrne and a major Republican fundraiser named Carolyn Wren, who actually, she worked with Julie, of course. The pillow guy, Mike Lindell, and Fox CEO Rupert Murdoch. And then 2 Texas donors that they in one part of the book they called them entrepreneurs, and in another part they called them businessmen. Morgan Watzler and John Robeson. Both of them we'll hear about later were critically important in some of the schemes that unfolded. Media personalities and pundits. Fox. And Tucker Carlson. Now, my name is Lorraine Carlson. There is no relation. He's not even a distant cousin, and I checked. Of course, followed by Pete Pirro, Luke Dobbs, Don Bongino, Maria Bartiromo, and then InfoWars, Alex Jones, Newsfax, Christopher Ruddy, and One America News Network, Pearson Sharp. Next down the line is, and of course this is in the numbers as they increase, that's why we put it in a pyramid. We have the right-wing militia leaders and white nationalist allies, the Stuart Rhodes of Oath Keepers, Enrique Tarrio of Proud Boys, Lucas Denny and Donald Hazard of the 3 Percenters, and then we've got Nick Fuentes and Michelle Malkin from a group called the Grouper Army, which I never heard of until I read the book, Doug Jensen from QAnon, and Ali Alexander from Stop the Steal. And last but not least, the Trump base. So numbers vary. Part of the book says 53,000, another place says 80,000. So I'm gathering somewhere between 53,000 and 80,000 Trump supporters amassed themselves in Washington to take back our country. And also to respond to be there, be wild.
So, what are the report's key take-home messages? Certainly, first of all, the report findings are based on facts, as I mentioned before, sworn testimony, and documents. The facts are text messages, emails, letters, public statements to the public and among the other members, action plans and specific actions to be taken to further each one of the schemes. Secondly, there was sworn testimony from more than 100 people who were directly involved, resulting in collaborative sworn statements. There was important information from relevant litigation in federal district and appellate courts, as well as the Supreme Court, and over 1,000 interviews were conducted, and 1 million documents were reviewed. And reading the 850 pages, you really believe it.
Trump's plot to overturn the election was premeditated and pre-planned. If Biden's winning, Trump is going to do some crazy shit, said Steve Bannon. That's just a lovely quote for the history books. In October of 2020, Steve Bannon made the quote displayed in reference to how Trump would maneuver if it appeared that Biden was or would win the election. Bannon reiterated this plan on the eve of the election again. On November 3rd, Bannon explained that Trump would, quote, declare victory that night. And that was the plan, as laid out by Biden, was that Trump would simply declare victory and call for all voting to stop, and that is exactly what transpired. However, it was not simply Trump advisors making these plans. Trump was an active participant and supporter, telling confidence that he would declare victory if it looked like he was winning. Starting long before the 2020 election, Donald Trump was pushing election fraud fears on his supporters to prime them for his future denials of loss. Throughout the year, Trump would claim without foundation that, quote, mail-in ballots are very dangerous and that they make elections rigged, quote. Furthermore, 2020 was not the beginning of Trump's false concerns over voter fraud. The now famous Stop the Steal slogan was first introduced back in 2016 by a Roger Stone affiliated group. Attempts to discredit the legitimacy of his opponent's electoral performance goes back to 2016. Despite winning the presidential election of 2016, Donald Trump immediately began claiming that, quote, millions of people voted illegally. Trump was so enamored with this idea that he launched a voting integrity commission after he took office. It's noteworthy, though, that the commission was disbanded after being unable to find any significant fraud.
Donald Trump was always in charge. Those who invaded our Capitol and battled law enforcement for hours were motivated by what President Trump had told them, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful president. President Trump summoned the mob and lit the flame of his attack. Vice Chair Liz Cheney. President Trump asked me to rescind the 2020 election, immediately remove Joe Biden from the White House, immediately put Trump back in the White House, and hold a new special election for the presidency. Representative Mo Brooks. Trump was in total command and control of everything that he and his allies said and did before, during, and after the 2020 election, from upending our democratic institutions, sowing doubt without actually proving anything, and opening the doors wide open to the metastatic hatred, open season bigotry, and epidemic of racial and religious animus that's threatening liberty, equality, and justice for all Americans. I believe I was following the instructions of former President Trump. He was my president and the commander-in-chief. I also left Washington and started back to Texas immediately after President Trump asked us to go home. Garrett Miller. We literally left right after Trump's 4:17 p.m. video came out. You know, to me, if he would have done it earlier in the day, 1:30, maybe we wouldn't be in this bad of a situation or something. Stephen Ayers. Gentlemen, our commander-in-chief just ordered us to go home. Ed Vallejo, Oathkeeper member, messaging other Oathkeepers at 4:25 p.m. It's clear that whatever Trump says determines how his base reacts. He said go to the Capitol, and they did. And when he said leave the Capitol, they did. The master and leader of all efforts to reverse his presidential election loss and stay in power was Donald Trump. While he was bolstered by dozens of primary architects and enabled by hundreds of co-conspirators encompassing all levels of government, all roads lead back to Trump.
Number 4, the big lie underpins Trump efforts to overturn the election, incite violence, undermine democracy, and grift 250 million out of ordinary people. Quote, the attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr. Trump's decisions to use false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and cling to power. The big lie was also a ripoff. Trump used the election lies to raise $250 million for his political action committee, Save America PAC, rather than to litigate his election claims. Both these quotes come from Representative Zoe Lofgren, who's on the committee. So let's agree that the big lie is a lie, period. Now, what is a lie? A lie is an untruthful assertion. It involves an intention to deceive, and first and foremost, we should understand that any statements made by Trump and his co-conspirators that the 2020 election was rigged or fraudulent is an absolute lie. And it was not a misunderstanding on Trump's part or anyone in his inner circle. Each effort to overturn the election relied on these 3 false ideas. Number 1, the election was rigged or stolen. Number 2, there was massive voter fraud and irregularities. And 3, the true voice of the people was rejected by a cabal of anti-Trump officials and actors working in concert to prevent Trump's victory. Trump was told from the beginning by his family, White House counsel, campaign managers, hand-picked advisors, Department of Justice, and the FBI, and maybe the National Security Council, that there was no fraud to be found. Between November and January, Trump was told at least 21 times that no one anywhere at any level of government, from the federal to the state level, could find evidence of sufficient fraud that would have corrupted the election. These rejections of fraud came from within Trump's hand-picked campaign staff and advisors. Some specific examples. There was Jason Miller, a senior advisor to Trump, who told him that there was no evidence of fraud sufficient to change the election outcome. There was Alex Cannon, a former Trump campaign lawyer, who was tasked with reviewing the allegations of election fraud that the campaign was compiling. By mid-November, Cannon's search turned up nothing. Matthew Morgan, Trump's campaign lawyer, also reported no evidence of widespread fraud, and Pat Cipollone, White House counsel, testified that he'd never seen any evidence of massive fraud and forcefully made this point to Trump over and over again. Acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue also testified at the committee that they had spent approximately 2 hours on the phone one day in early December with Trump going over each one of the claims, debunking various conspiracy theories and telling him, Mr. President, there is no fraud. Despite all evidence to the contrary, Trump pressed ahead with his big lie and undertook a massive fundraising campaign based off of those claims, sending out about millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 times a day, between Election Day and January 6th, asking them, step up to protect the integrity of the election. But this is where it gets interesting. Instead of the money going to Trump's, quote, official election defense fund, end quote, committee investigators found that most of the $250 million went to Trump's Save America PAC and other Trump-adjacent organizations. In other words, the big lie was a big ripoff. Because Trump fundraising campaign staffers and more have testified that the official election defense fund didn't actually exist. And it was all just a marketing tactic. Now, seriously, mail fraud and wire fraud are both federal crimes, punishable by a $1 million fine or imprisonment for up to 30 years. telling people that you send them for money that doesn't exist is a crime. It's not a violation of norms or questionable use of presidential power or an obstruction of investigation. It's theft. If I sent out emails, letters, requesting everyone here to please Zelle or Venmo me money for my cat's vet bills, and I don't have a cat, and instead I repurposed the monies for Lorraine's Vacation Defense Fund, I'd end up going to jail. Especially, it'd be obvious, right? Thankfully, Special Counsel Jack Smith's office recently just sent subpoenas to Trump advisors and former campaign aides a few weeks ago, seeking a wide range of documents related to the fundraising after the 2020 election to see whether anyone associated with Trump's fundraising operations violated federal wire fraud laws, which makes it illegal to make false representations over email to swindle people like you and me out of money.
So what were the components of this big lie? Red mirage, dumps, voting after the polls closed, and rigged voting machines. Despite being vocal and fear-mongering around mail-in ballots, Donald Trump's own campaign manager, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, and Trump's advisor Jared Kushner all encouraged Trump to support mail-in ballots. In fact, White House counselor Hope Hicks testified that it was her understanding that Trump was fully aware that mail-in voting was, quote, fine. Moreover, Trump won 12 states in which there was no excuse absentee voting, despite his claims that these types of voting methods were fraudulent. Interestingly, there were no challenges to the election outcomes in those states. In addition to mail-in ballots, a major component of the big lie was the misrepresentation of the red mirage. This involved creating false perceptions that Trump won on election day due to the timing of mail-in ballots being counted around the country. Since Democrats use mail-in ballots to vote in greater numbers than Republicans, and mail-in ballots are often not tabulated until days, and sometimes weeks, after an in-person voting on the election, the initial election day vote counts usually lean more heavily Republican. However, this is the mirage. As mail-in ballots are processed, the election often swings to the Democrats' favor. Despite his claims otherwise, Trump was fully aware that a red mirage usually occurs on election day after the polls close. In fact, Trump's own campaign manager, Bill Stepien, testified that he told Trump that the red mirage would occur on election night. And the mirage event was by no means unique to 2020. Research into electoral shifts has shown that these mirages appear in almost every swing state election since 2004. This long history of election day mirages due to voting patterns was also attested to by Chris Stirewalt, former head of the Fox News elections desk. He testified that over the past 40 or 50 years, quote, Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or earlier absentee, and that, quote, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans. In nearly every election, Stirewalt elaborated, Republicans win election day and Democrats win in the early mail-in voting, and then you wait and you start counting. It, quote, happens every time. Trump also falsely claimed that Democrats were continuing to vote after the polls closed. Indeed, this is exactly what Steve Bannon described would occur in 2020 when he said Trump would take advantage of Democrats' natural disadvantage on election night. In the following days and weeks, Trump often referred to dumps of votes being injected into the counting process. His supporters quickly latched onto these false claims, yet there were no dumps, just tallies of absentee ballots as they were reported by jurisdictions throughout the country in a fully transparent process. Nothing about this was out of the ordinary. Trump also falsely claimed that Dominion voting system machines were being manipulated into handing Biden a victory. Between Election Day and January 6th, Trump tweeted this lie more than 30 times and repeated the same lie in post-election speeches and interviews. However, as early as November 12th, the Trump campaign's own internal research team had finished their analysis of the Dominion voting machines and reported directly to President Trump in the company of other prominent White House attorneys and staffs that Dominion voting machines, quote, did not lead to improper vote counts.
Okay, how are we feeling? I know, there's more. But wait a second. Now that we've covered the report's findings, the pyramid of co-conspirators, the key themes, and take-home messages. Wow, it feels really good to see so much of you back. It means we haven't bored you completely to death.
It scared us, but not more.
So, pardon me, I had a little bit of one of those snack bars, and now I'm going to have to drink water. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to all the volunteers who helped us with the room setup, check-in, making sure you're all hydrated and fortified. Thank you one and all. Let's give a round of applause. So let's get going. This part we're going to cover Trump's 8-part coup plot to overturn Biden's win. Now, an interesting thing, the words strategy, coup plot, plan are all interwoven, interchangeable and interwoven throughout the report. The interesting thing is that it was Ari Melber who came up with this idea of the coup plot, and he wrote the foreword to this, the book. Okay. So, despite what anyone may think or have heard, what happened from November 2020 until January 6th wasn't just the sign of a few things going wrong. We all lived it, if you remember, that period of time. Trump's 8-part scheme or coup to overturn the 2020 election and stay in power was a vast enterprise involving scores of people at all levels of government. As shown by this graphic, taken from the report, Ari Melber presented a simple but effective timeline identifying each plot and how they worked independently and together in order to try to achieve Trump's ultimate goal. And as we go through each scheme, we will be highlighting the relevant facts and quotes from each chapter in the book so that it kind of all ties them all in together. So I'm going to cover number 1. And I want to start with, after the lawsuits, all the remaining plots were unconstitutional or illegal by January, according to Ari Melber. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is at the top of the screen. Well, not at the top of the screen any longer, but now in the lawsuits section. Yes, is lawsuits. And I do want to just quickly put a shout out to our, which I failed to do before, our graphic designer, Nicole Johnson, who put this incredible PowerPoint together, and she is the author of this wonderful, colorful version of Ari Melber's timeline. So in the lawsuits section, number 1, the Trump team brought forth 62 lawsuits, which resulted in 61 losses and 1 single tiny little victory. About half of those cases were dismissed at the procedural stage due to no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters. On top of that, in cases that were not immediately dismissed, in no instance did a court find that the charges were real. This was according to Ben Ginsburg, who was a GOP election lawyer. One of the first methods, and the only legally valid one, that Trump used in order to overturn the election was a series of court cases filed in the major battleground states of Arizona, New Mexico, Michigan, on and on. As with the refutations of voter fraud that came from within Trump's own trusted inner circle, it should be noted that of the cases brought forth in those 62 cases, 22 of the judges were appointed by Republicans and 10 were appointed by Trump himself. But he lost in 61 out of 62.
Okay, the fake electors. Everybody remember that little deal? So, Trump and his advisors pushed for the rules to be changed after the election, even if it meant disenfranchising millions of Americans. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the vice president had this kind of authority, and that's Greg Jacob, who is the vice president counsel. As per Chapter 2 of the report, Trump's effort to pressure state legislators to disregard the vote counts and instead appoint Trump electors to vote in the Electoral College was premised on the incorrect theory that, quote, because the Constitution assigns to state legislatures the role of directing how the Electoral College electors are chosen, which, by the way, every state legislature had done before the election, giving the power to the people at the ballot boxes, then the state legislatures could simply choose Trump-Pence electors after seeing the election results. In other words, Trump and his advisors pushed for the rules to be changed after the election, even if it meant disenfranchising millions of Americans. To give the appearance of legitimacy for Trump overturning the election, a scheme was developed by Trump attorneys Kenneth Chesebro and John Eastman to create an alternative slate of false, fake electors who would be loyal to Trump. Republican electors signed illegitimate certifications in 7 states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, New Mexico, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that falsely declared Trump had won those states. These are the false statements at issue with the committee's 3rd DOJ charging referral: conspiracy to make a false statement, by providing factual evidence that Trump used those slates of false electors to falsely claim that Pence could decline to certify the official Biden electors from those states on January 6th. Trump's plan was predicated on a false interpretation of the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act of 1887. The 12th Amendment specifies that the Vice President will open all certificates, those are the Electoral College votes, and the Electoral Count Act specifies that the result of the counts shall be delivered to the Vice President. Constitutionally, the Vice President's role on January 6th was nothing more than a ministerial responsibility. Despite John Eastman being the author of this plan, he admitted on multiple occasions that such an interpretation of the VPs having unilateral power to decide the election outcome was both wrong and totally illegal. Moreover, Greg Jacob, Pence's counsel, had done extensive research on and historical analysis of both the Electoral College Act of 1887 and the Constitution's 12th Amendment, and concluded that the Vice President must adhere to the Electoral Count Act. Jacob found there was no justifiable basis to conclude that the Vice President has this kind of authority to affect the outcome of the presidential election. And in a subsequent Oval Office conversation between Trump, Jacob, and Eastman on January 3rd, Eastman admitted in front of the president that there was no lawful way for Pence to go through with the fake elector scheme or for the VP to assume unilateral decision-making power regarding who gets to be president. But Eastman kept pushing them anyway. It's clear from eyewitness testimony that Trump knew that Eastman's fake elector scheme was illegal, and in fact knew it violated the Electoral Count Act of 1887 and the US Constitution. But Trump, being Trump, repeatedly demanded Pence go through with the scheme anyway.
So next we're going to try to overturn the state votes. An article published, hold on just a second. An article published on September 23rd, 2020 in The Atlantic explained, according to sources in the Republican Party at the state and national levels, the Trump campaign is discussing contingency plans to bypass election results and appoint loyal electors in battleground states where Republicans hold the legislative majority, with justification based on claims of rampant fraud. Trump would ask state legislators to set aside the popular vote and exercise their power to choose a slate of electors directly on their own. By relying on the big lie, Trump sought out to potentially loyal Republican cohorts in the states to overturn the election results and declare that Trump won in a state that he had actually lost. Alternatively, to overturn the election and appointing new electors, Trump allies in Congress and White House co-conspirators also proposed the idea of telling loyal state legislators to simply not certify the legitimate slate of electors, send none to be read aloud when the joint session of Congress met on January 6th, and instead force a one-state vote in the House, which they knew Trump would win. This one-state vote means that if the election were pushed aside, the election would go to a one-state, one-vote vote in the House of Representatives, and unfortunately, with that, Trump would have won. On November 11, 2020, Morgan Worsler, a Texas entrepreneur close to his best bud, Governor Rick Perry, tweeted that he was, quote, in the Oval Office yesterday, and months later wrote that I told the whole Trump team in the Oval Office that state legislatures can choose the electors no matter what the current state law or state courts say. Boy, what a rocket scientist. Beginning on November 25th through December 3rd, Trump, through his best bud Giuliani, orchestrated fake so-called hearings with legislators in 4 key swing states, including Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, to advance conspiracy theories about election integrity. The hearings were, of course, not legitimate, and people were never placed under oath. So during this same time period, Trump and his inner circle also engaged in 200 apparent acts of public or private outreach, pressure, or condemnation, targeting other state legislators or state and or local local administrators, to overturn state election results. You may remember he invited one state group after another to the White House to coerce them, to use a polite word.
So to expand upon what Bob mentioned about the House vote, this is Congress overturns the vote. So the plot to use Congress to overturn the election relied on the perversion of a legitimate power of Congress outlined in the Constitution. In the event that a presidential election is legitimately contested and neither candidate has a majority, then before anything moves to the courts, the House of Representatives is able to resolve the contested race with its own vote. But in this case, it is one vote per state. And as we can see from the map, this would easily have led to a Trump victory. To this end, Trump applied keen pressure on Republican members of Congress to object to the election results when the joint session of Congress met on January 6th to certify the election and declare Joe Biden the winner.
Pence overturns electoral votes. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, and we win, Trump tweeted. Do it, Mike. This is time for extreme courage. Again, Captain Bone Spurs. The plot that involves Trump convincing Pence to object to and or refuse to count otherwise completely legitimate cast electoral votes from each state when the joint session of Congress met on July 6th is covered in detail in Chapter 5 of the report. In the report, the chapter is appropriately titled, quote, a coup in search of a legal theory, and it proves the intellectual framework underpinning the, quote, without any legal basis theory put forth by John Eastman, that the vice president could unilaterally change the outcome of the election at the joint session of Congress on January 6th. On December 23rd, 2020, John Eastman drafted the first of his 2 January 6th scenario memos articulating the argument that under the Constitution, the vice president is the ultimate arbiter. Eastman's January 6th scenario clearly required the VP to violate the Electoral Count Act, the federal law governing the certification of presidential elections. Eastman's theory was, in the words of Trump's senior White House and campaign official, quote, insane, crazy, nutty, and, quote, "It would never work." The VP's counsel, Greg Jacob, did extensive research on and historical analysis of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 and the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. After reviewing the history and relevant cases, Jacob found that there is no justifiable basis to conclude that the Vice President has that kind of authority to affect the outcome of the presidential election.
Let's try that again. Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me. Handwritten contemporaneous notes handed over to the committee by AGs Rosen and Donahue showed perhaps the most audacious moment in the months-long pressure campaign aimed at enlisting top DOJ officials to aid in Trump's campaign to overturn the election. Trump requested that Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen and Deputy AG Richard Donahue, and I quote, to just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me. Trump's demands were an extraordinary instance of a president interfering with an agency that serves independently from the White House in order to advance his own personal agenda. In response to Rosen and Donahue's resistance, Trump attempted to install his hand-picked election fraud supporter, DOJ employee Jeffrey Clark, to become Attorney General. Who was Jeffrey Clark? Jeffrey Clark was no one. Jeffrey Clark was a mid-level environmental attorney in the Department of Justice with no experience or expertise in elections or national security concerns. As part of the scheming between Trump and Clark, Clark submitted a draft letter to Rosen and Donahue to sign, which falsely claimed that the DOJ had been investigating various irregularities in the 2020 election and called on states to hold special legislative sessions. Their goal was to secure an alternate slate of electors who would cast votes for Donald Trump and overturn Biden's victory. In no uncertain terms, Rosen and Donahue made it clear to Trump that the path he was taking was not one that any reasonable person in the DOJ would stand for. Trump was told that if he continued down this road, the entire slate of attorney generals would resign. This pressure prevented the complete corruption of the Department of Justice and caused Trump to back down from this plot.
One of the few that he actually backed down. So now I have the pleasure of talking about number 7, the military seized voting machines, declare martial law. There are 2 quotes at the top, which I'm going to refer to as we get into it. Okay. There's a draft executive order by then President Donald Trump dated December 16th, 2020, which would have instructed the Secretary of Defense to, quote, seize, collect, retain, and analyze all machines, equipment, electronically stored information, and material records required for retention under U.S. election law, and given the Secretary of Defense 60 days to provide an assessment. Now, do the math. December to 60 days later would be sometime in mid-February. Under the order, Trump would also appoint a special counsel with the power to seize machines and then charge people with crimes with all resources necessary to carry out, now this was interesting, her duties. Who is her? According to the report, Trump wanted to tap Sidney Powell, an attorney for one-time National Security Advisor Mike Flynn, and someone who is promoting numerous conspiracy theories about the election, as special counsel to probe the claims, investigate his loss, and press for the seizing of voting machines Trump claimed were manipulated to rig the outcome against him. Okay, December 16th. 2 days later, on December 18th, Sidney Powell, Michael Flynn, pillow guy Mike Lindell, and former Overstock CEO Patrick Byrne, you've heard these names, we've mentioned them a few times, right? Met with Trump, Giuliani, and others in the Oval Office, not just to advocate for seizing voting machines, that's not enough, but also for Trump to declare a national emergency invoking martial law, which is the imposing of rule by military force. Again, this executive order was never issued, thank God. because the scheme was blunted almost immediately when Trump was reminded, and you can imagine what was going on in this Oval Office meeting, that an appointed special counsel had absolutely no legal authority to order the military or the Department of Justice to seize voting machines. Further, General Mark A. Milley, 20th Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is the nation's highest-ranking military officer and the principal military advisor to the President, General Mark Milley, also to the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council. I mean, this is a very important guy. Along with 10 other former Secretaries of Defense, published an op-ed letter in the Washington Post signed by all of them on January 3rd. Think of the date, 3 days before the certification, stating that the military would, quote, have no role in determining the outcome of the election. And when he was deposed on live TV by the House Select Committee back in April of 2022, now I'm actually referring to the televised hearings that we all watched, a gentleman named J. Michael Ludig, who is a conservative legal scholar and a former judge, said, Trump's invocation of these emergency powers would have been unprecedented in all of American history. I'm going to repeat that. Trump's invocation of these emergency powers would have been unprecedented in all of American history. However, the idea of seizing machines and declaring martial law was also strongly advocated by several key Republican members of Congress, including Representative Scott Perry, who during Oval Office meetings with Trump in December of 2020 argued that the only path for Trump to change the 2020 outcome and stay in power was for him to declare martial law.
Can I just put one point in here? With regard to that letter that Milley and 10 other former Secretaries of Defense authored, that was instigated by Liz Cheney. So she was behind getting them to write that letter. So just keep that in mind.
So, in a sense, the Capitol insurrection was really the apex of a multifaceted scheme to overturn democracy in the United States. And when all the other measures failed, there was nothing left but violence. So Donald Trump lit the fire of the Capitol insurrection, there's no question. The violence was anticipated, and it was known to Trump and encouraged by Trump explicitly and implicitly. During Trump's speech on the eclipse, there were roughly 53,000 people in attendance, and about half of those people refused to go through metal detectors and be screened for weapons. Of course, there was a reason. According to testimony given to the committees, Trump was informed that this sizable group did not want to come into the venue because they have weapons that they don't want to be confiscated by the Secret Service. So Trump was said to be furious upon learning this and reportedly shouted at his team that he didn't care whether they had weapons or not. They're not here to hurt me. Take the metal detectors away. These are quotes, by the way. Let my people in. Despite knowing his supporters were armed and angry, Trump wanted them to have the run of the Capitol. Trump's action and inaction gravely threatened democracy and put lives of American lawmakers at risk, as well as scores of congressional staff members and hundreds of Capitol police officers who were on the scene that day. Then there are those whom he duped into rioting and committing violence with incendiary tweets such as, "Be there, it will be wild." All these people were played, and I think many of them now understand that. But from the insurrection's outset, and for several hours that followed, people inside President Trump's administration, elected officials of both parties, members of President Trump's family, and Fox News commentators sympathetic to Trump, all tried to get him to do the one singular thing, which was instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. A report The report provides quotes from testimony given by Ivanka Trump and lovely Donald Jr. that they asked their father to tell the rioters to go home sooner, but he refused. Despite appeals from his inner circle, Trump did not tell the insurrectionists to go home for 3 hours and 7 minutes. Instead, watching the insurrection and violence escalate on television, and he made many calls to supportive Republican members of Congress, telling them to object to the legitimate electoral certificates and insert the bogus fake electors instead, while the insurrection was going on. As per the facts and quotes stated earlier, Trump was in full control. Trump would have told his supporters to go home. If he had told his supporters to go home, they would, and they would have complied immediately.
So, to every story that has a villain, we hope that there's someone who does the right thing. I wouldn't say that they're the people in the white hats, but while we know that these plots were truly horrifying, it's invaluable to remember that they didn't work. Thankfully, Trump was stopped by a relatively small number of people who did the right thing. And we want to take a moment to acknowledge the officials and staffers who stood between Trump's power grab and the upending of American democracy. Judge David O. Carter, who is the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, who rejected Trump's baseless claims of fraud and wrote in his ruling upholding the subpoena for nearly all of the 111 documents from Eastman sought by the House Select Committee. Quote, Trump, with his ally, lawyer John Eastman, launched a campaign to overturn a democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history. Their campaign was not confined to the ivory tower. It was a coup in search of a legal theory. If the plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transfer of power, undermining American democracy and the Constitution. This is a quote from the judge. Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, who withstood countless texts and phone calls from Trump and also Lindsey Graham, asking him to find 11,780 votes that could flip his state to prevent Biden's election victory. But instead, he maintained the sanctity of the Georgia election despite Trump's illegal meddling. Gabe Sterling, who became a notable figure during Georgia's long recount in 2020 when he urged Trump to tone down the rhetoric. Rusty Bowers, former Arizona Republican House Speaker, who was subjected to numerous Trump phone calls and a public smear campaign, including relentless bullhorn protests at his home and pistol-wielding Trump supporter taunting his family and neighbors. Deputy AG Richard Donahue and Jeffrey Rosen, both acting AGs, who led the DOJ staff efforts to prevent total corruption of the department by organizing more than 100 attorneys, signing a letter threatening to resign if Trump pursued installing Jeffrey Clark as a pliable Trump puppet who would push a false narrative about election integrity. Vice President Legal Counsel Greg Jacob, who publicly stated that the Vice President had no constitutional authority to participate in the schemes being thrust upon him. The Honorable J. Michael Ludig, who provided legal counsel and affirmation supporting the Vice President's refusal to act in a unilateral and totally illegal manner by challenging the validity of Biden's electoral certificates and replacing them with bogus Trump elector certificates from 5 states, thereby saving our country from a real constitutional crisis. Reluctantly but true, we need to acknowledge it, Vice President Mike Pence, who lived up to his constitutional duties and ensured the legitimate transfer of power after a free and fair election. Georgia election workers Wandra Shea Moss and her mother, Ruby Freeman, who had to go into hiding because of death threats after Trump put a bullseye on their backs by accusing them of voter fraud. Cassidy Hutchinson, former top aide to Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, for providing truthful, candid, and granular recollections of her personal interactions with Trump, Giuliani, Mark Meadows, White House counsel, and various members of Congress on the days before, during, and after January 6th. Vice Chair Representative Liz Cheney, former representative, who voted for Trump's impeachment before she was part of the House Select Committee, voted for Joe Biden's certification, and in the words of Chairman Benny Thompson, demonstrated again and again her commitment to getting answers about January 6th, ensuring accountability, and doing whatever it takes to protect democracy for the American people. And as we know, she did it at the detriment of her career, as she is now a former representative. Representative Adam Kinzinger, who voted to impeach for Trump and was one of 2 Republicans serving on the House Select Committee. He was so fed up with Washington that he was not running again, and he is out. Chris Krebs, director of the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, who after calling the 2020 election the most secure election in U.S. history on November 12, 2020, was immediately fired by Trump.
Okay, so how do we keep all this from happening again? The committee gave a number of recommendations to that point. Number 1, Trump should be barred from holding federal or state office forever. That's a good one. Number 2, creative. I think we're losing it. All right, I'll step. Number 2. Create a formal mechanism to evaluate and determine if those who took part in the insurrection should be barred from holding future government office. Try it again? Okay. Enact stronger criminal penalties for those who obstruct a peaceful transfer of power. Enact, they're all good. Enact federal penalties for those who threaten election workers. Grant Congress greater powers to enforce its own subpoenas in federal courts.
Continuing on, grant Congress more oversight over the Capitol Police. Grant Congress greater scrutiny of media company policies which spread false information that radicalizes and promotes consumers to attack their own country. Evaluate risks posed to future elections when presidents are pressured to deploy an armed militia or federal troops to crack down on domestic rebellion or insurrection. Make Congress's joint session on January 6th a, quote, national special security event, which would require enhanced security protections and advanced planning and preparation for the proceedings.
Reform the Electoral Count Act to protect presidential elections from being overturned in the future. The measure would clarify that the vice president's role in certifying election results is strictly ministerial and increase the threshold for objecting to a state's electoral votes. Adopt whole of government strategies to address the violent threat posed by all extremist groups, and that various intelligence and law enforcement agencies better synchronize themselves in sharing information on a timely basis. Urge courts and local bar associations to disqualify members of the legal profession who participate in efforts to undermine our democratic institutions. Have DOJ adopt guardrails ensuring that agency employees steer clear of campaign-related activities.
And so we come to the insights and conclusions. Number 1, Trump's bloodless coup scheme came perilously close to succeeding, and there is no reason to believe it won't be attempted again. Corrective measures must be enacted to protect democracy in the future. Number 2, the insurrection is a first for the United States in that it shattered convention, by putting violence on the table. When the person in charge of the military and the nukes publicly says, quote, "There won't be a peaceful transfer of power," the country is already in a bad spot. Trump's inflammatory lies stoked expectations and created the narrative and the playbook that his followers use to justify their cause.
There are fundamental weaknesses with our Constitution's electoral college system. We can't let mainstream media off the hook either, because they were fully complicit in elevating Trump's voice in the pursuit of profit.
So not to be outdone, 850 pages, our group leader found, I think, 4 more addenda, one of which, addendum number 2, refers to the big ripoff. The use of the big lie to fraudulently solicit donations creates a catch-22 for the Republican Party. The moment the Republicans stop lying becomes the moment donors stop sending money. This guarantees that Republicans and Trump must keep this con going on. Secondly, my own personal observation, you look at the behavior of many of the leaders and the facilitators of this scheme, and you wonder about their motivations. Now, some of them may have been motivated by money. I'm a believer that there's a reason why things happen. So some of these may have been motivated by money. Some may have been motivated by the thirst of potential unfettered power. If they were able to make this work, they could get pardoned for anything. Maybe there was extortion or coercion. You look at Lindsey Graham and his spectacular reversal from calling Trump a charlatan to tearful pleading to people to send him money. What in the world has gone on here? And I wonder, this is my own personal thought, I wonder if considering what J. Edgar Hoover had, the dirt that he had on people that some presidents used, and Trump had Christopher Wray was Trump's appointed head of the FBI. You wonder how much Trump knows about some people and whether this is also a motivation for some of their behavior. This is speculation on my part, but I can't help but wonder.
So, as we saw, there were any number of individuals attempting to undermine or prevent the January 6th committee from doing their work, and we have to ask why. The people involved in crafting these plans, either indirectly or directly, were smart enough to know that if they got away with it, everything would be okay despite the illegality. But now that they didn't get away with it, they have to try and stop any investigation so they don't face any consequences. The big lie. The big lie provides an invaluable tool for undermining trust in government and each other. According to Timothy Snyder, author of On Tyranny, a lie is a big lie because you have to disbelieve all kinds of evidence to believe in it. It's a big lie because you have to believe in a huge conspiracy in order to believe it. And it's a big lie because if you believe it, you must take radical action. The big lie is corrosive and destructive to our society and form of government, and that impact cannot be understated. As recent as last month, a CNN poll concluded that 63% of Republican respondents still believe that Biden did not win the 2020 election. And we can look to the most recent midterms to see the myriad of candidates that ran on the big lie and extended it into their own races, preemptively crying fraud in elections that hadn't even taken place yet.
So, number 9, the insurrection wasn't free speech, nor was it a typical day of tourists visiting the Capitol. So let's identify January 6th for what it is and what it was. A bloody insurrection that was not in any way, shape, or form an act of protected speech. There's simply no First Amendment right to cite an insurrection. And according to U.S. Supreme Court, the Constitution does not protect conduct that is, quote, directing to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to produce such action, end quote. And probably the most hardest conclusion or insights that we came from this: Trump succeeded in sowing doubt about the integrity of U.S. institutions and Biden's election legitimacy in the eyes of millions of Americans.
So as the group was winding up its workshop, we felt that it was important toward the end of the presentation to come up with some action items that we can all take. And so the first one that comes to mind is that members of Congress need to recodify the FCC's fairness doctrine and declare January 6th as a national security event as soon as the Democrats take back the House and retain the Senate in 2024, God willing.
The second action item is to stay vigilant and learn about what avenues of democratic attack still exist. Attend Courageous Resistance meetings and join this committee.
Yeah, we're happy to have you.
Vote and help get out the vote by joining Courageous Resistance Voter Registration Committee.
Learn how elections function in the U.S. and our state. So much of the big lie was based around using people's misunderstanding or lack of knowledge about how elections function. With these misunderstandings, it's easy to twist perceptions about totally normal events, the red mirage, and make them feel abnormal in order to scare people. The only challenge to this is knowledge and the truth, and it's on us to gain that knowledge, and more importantly, to spread that truth.
So last but not least, in lieu of a constitutional amendment to void the Electoral College, okay, help enact the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which for anybody that doesn't know, it's an agreement among a group of U.S. states and the District of Columbia to award all electoral votes to whichever presidential ticket wins the overall popular vote in the 50 states and District of Columbia. So we also, if you notice on the back of the agenda, we've also listed contacting, one of our top things is contacting your members of Congress. So how do you find them? And there's listing here on the back, the 3 websites for you to find out from the House, the Senate, and find your rep, legislature.ca.gov for the state of California. We hope you'll do more, and we hope you'll take these suggestions to heart and help us. We're all here just like you, and trying to understand how this all occurred. We've said it. I mean, this book was hard, and it was hard to read because we had to basically, practically take a shower after reading certain sections. It was repetitive. I mean, what was also challenging about the book was the fact that a fact would come up with part of the information, then a couple chapters later it'd be repeated again with more information. So you were like going, well, wait a minute, wait, I thought I read that. What, So, and I think that's because the people that actually put the report together, the 9 members of the committee and all their staffers, and they had a lot of investigators working on this. Unlike the Mueller report, there wasn't one voice, one author of this book. There were several, and it showed. But I think we tried to do the best we could to try to pull out the most important parts. So we'd like to open it up to Q&A. If people have questions, something we didn't cover, something you want to know more about, well, hopefully we did great. It's 4 to 7. How many 2.5-hour meetings have you ever gone to that actually end early? It's not over yet. Yes. So who's got a question in the back?
Yeah. Is there anything about the representatives who gave tours to the crowd Proud Boys and others at the Capitol.
Repeat the
Yes,
question, repeat
yes,
the
the
question.
question
Repeat.
was, is there any information about the Proud Boys and others who gave tours at the Capitol, correct? Right? The representatives that gave tours. Well, you know from news media reports, there's been a lot about that. There's that one particular congressman, name escapes me at the moment, Louisiana perhaps, who was responsible for basically having the Proud Boys and others get to see schematic designs of the actual White House complex. Not White House, the Capitol complex. That is referenced in the book, but unfortunately, there is no what's it in the back where you can look up something? Index. There's no index. So so yes, more to be learned about that. Another question. I think I've got one here. Oh yeah, is there any information about the complicity by the Secret Service trying to remove Pence from the basement? It didn't really go into that at all. There is in the addendum, I think it was addendum 1, where it goes into a little bit more about the security failures of the various government agencies. But that is basically testimony that was not necessary. Do you guys remember anything like that? I don't remember that being included.
No, there was nothing included.
Right. But I'm sure a lot more is coming out now with the Department of Justice investigation. There's a question about what is happening regarding mail fraud crimes. Well, we know that there is going on with that. That's really pretty exciting that the Department of Justice is just, I think it was an April 12th article in either the Post or New York Times about the special counsel, now Jack Smith, taking this on. So that's there. Okay, information about the purposeful minimizing of risk at the Capitol building. This is one of the, there are articles out there that talk about what's missing in this report. And so we decided that we weren't going to actually include, because we're, just like you, we're reading all this stuff too. We did not want to bring in current information. We wanted to stay strictly to what's in the book.
Yeah, that's good.
So keep tabs on it. Any other questions? Yes, gentlemen.
Well, I just, nobody's talked about the idea that if people believe the big lie and that the election was invalid, then all of the Congress people, all the senators, all the propositions, everything else that's on the ballot would have been invalid too. They'd have to, it's just impossible to even think about all that.
Jamie,
Well, I think to that end, they didn't really care about that. And it was brought up at various times, not necessarily in the report, but in other reporting, that people did question, well, if this is invalid for the presidency, what about your senator? What about you? Whatever. No. It's only. It did come up in Arizona with what's her name? Carrie Lake. That she also was going to do the big lie, and it was all election fraud and everything, and everybody basically talked that down. So they didn't care about that because it wasn't true. So there's no way to answer that for them.
Over here. There's a lot of things here worth commenting on. One of which is even some of the people that you cited as standing up against Trump still said they'd vote for him if he was the next president. So, there's a great divide here between what we are thinking and what most of these Republicans are thinking. To them, any Republican, even if it's Trump, is better than any possible Democrat, and you are not going to change their minds. Another point I would make is on the Electoral Count Act, your final comment. We've been at this for 30 or more years. We've got all the low-hanging fruit. You're 70 or 80 electoral votes away, and you're not going to get any of those votes. This is never going to happen.
Well, this is, I'm sorry, Larry.
No, go ahead.
I think it's important to note that 2 weekends ago, the Democratic Women of the Desert hosted Adam Schiff. And we asked him a few questions around things like this, and basically it comes down to vote. 2024, we have to turn back the House and the Senate to the Democrats so that they can push through things like the national, the last thing. So that basically if a candidate wins the popular vote in the state, that they could throw out using the Electoral College, and it would be basically, one vote, per, popular vote. There are three, what's it called, the
National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
So the compact, according to Adam Schiff, is missing 2 or 3 states. 3 states? 3 states. And we can, pretty much guess what states they are. And so internally in those states, on state level elections, they need to vote out the red. And then those states will join, and then we don't have to have a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College. All we have is the compact, and it's basically popular vote.
Right. It's a really good workaround. That's the thing. Yes.
Sure. You did a fantastic job.
I don't know if there are any more questions, but before we wrap up and everything, while it's true that all of us worked on this for 3.5 months, we basically could not have done it without the leadership of Lorraine, who particularly in the last week and a half, she's gotten maybe an hour or 2 sleep a night. And so this is from all of us for you. Thank you. And if everybody else knows, Lorraine has a penchant for these kind of things, since she also chaired the Mueller report presentation.
Thank you, Lorraine.
I may say, I'm just sort of, I see this, and it's part of this, my mother would say it's the Swedish fire that says you don't like to see things that are, totally going against the grain and totally wrong. This was a real fun. I mean, I meant it when I said at the beginning. It's been really, really gratifying. And what's really fun is that working with this group of people, we were using critical thinking. Oh my God, critical thinking, which is something they don't teach anymore. And obviously, we're going to have to do a lot. Maybe that has to be added to the list of recommendations, is that, bring back critical thinking in the schools. Or all of us need to go and be tutors, one or the other. But anyway, but thank you all for coming and really, really help get involved. Get involved with Courageous Resistance. How? Oh, Carol. Is Carol still here? Or Lois? At the front.
We'll get you to sign up.
We'll get you to sign up. We've got sign-in sheets and your name and email, and then you'll find out about meetings. Monthly meetings are on the first Monday of the month. We have one coming up next Monday. They've been at Mizell, which has a better sound system. And it's a great group.
It is a good group.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Hey everybody, Nicholas Snow here with PromoHomo.TV. It was my pleasure to come and record this for the group, to help them document this really hard work. I want to give a shout out to Kelly Watson, who also was very much involved in helping this happen tonight, although she could not be here. So, wherever you are, remember, we all can do something more than we're currently doing. So I encourage you to fight for democracy.